Baseball is in trouble, and just over a month and a half ago, it seemed like a sure thing that the MLB would be the first of the four major North American sports leagues to make their return. But since then, the MLB and their Players Association have come to a standstill, refusing to negotiate, all the while using the media as an in-between to actually make negotiations happen, like a pair of petulant school children. All the while spinning more and more around, and potentially flushing this whole season down the drain. It all begs the question, how did we get here, and what does happen if we do lose the season entirely? In the last month, we heard first from the NHL and then the NBA about plans to make a return to the playoffs, and in the NBA's case, even a little bit more regular season. And while the NFL hasn't necessarily been out of the headlines, it does seem like they are still full steam ahead to a full regular season, even if it does happen without fans in the stands. Meanwhile, the MLB, who seemed likely to be the first league to return when this all began, now seem as close to having no season at all as they do to having a season of any kind. And given what we were hearing just over a month ago, it seems unbelievable that we are at this point now. Even into the last week of March, the MLB was still eyeing the possibility of a full 162-game season, even with the knowledge that the season probably wouldn't be able to start until sometime in June, using double headers and probably extending the season into October and maybe even a little bit of November in order to make that happen. And although the idea of a full season may have been overly optimistic even then, the idea of starting the season in June, or at least by the 4th of July, was one that they seem to have held on to all the way into May, when we heard that the Cleveland Indians, among other teams, were starting to tell players to get ready for baseball happening soon. And then, just a few days later, the MLB released its first proposal for a return to play, a plan that outlined an 82-game season and included things like a drastically expanded playoffs, realigned divisions, and a universal DH. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable plan, making the best of a bad situation and getting a reasonably long regular season, all the while trying out some things that the MLB has been toying with anyway to see if they could potentially work and see if they're worth looking more into in the future. But while a plan for losing half of the season financially isn't something that anybody was happy with, and there are still plenty of people in baseball who don't like the idea of expanding the playoffs, that wasn't the issue that the players had. The biggest issue and the sticking point that became the non-starter for the Players Association was the idea of a 50-50 revenue split. Back when this all started in March, the players in the league sat down and agreed to 100% prorated contracts for the players, which does mean that if they were to play fewer games, the players would take whatever percentage of games that were lost as a hit in percentage to their salary. But as it became obvious that fans weren't going to be able to attend the games regardless of when they did finally get the season started, the MLB decided to propose that 50-50 revenue split that ended up pissing off the players so much, but more on that later. In an effort to work out the paid portion of their proposal, the MLB announced its economic recovery plan on May 27th. The plan ditched the revenue splitting that was such a non-starter with the players in the first proposal and replaced it with tiered salary cuts that hit the top paid players the most and hit the least paid players the least. But since it left those top paid players with just around a third of their original salaries, it's pretty clear how this proposal went over. Plus, it does seem a little bit rich for a group of billionaires to come up with a plan that has the highest paid people take the biggest cut and the lowest paid people get the most leeway, considering these are the same people that spend their off time lobbying politicians to make sure that they don't have to pay their fair share of taxes, much less pay any extra. But that's far from the point here. The point is the players didn't like it and said no. So then, in order to give the MLB some idea of where the Players Association thought a good starting point could be for potential negotiations, they unveiled a plan for a 114-game season with 100% prorated salaries. And even threw in something that nobody had brought up in either of the previous deals, that being the idea of deferred payment of salaries for any potential missed postseason games in the case of a second outbreak of COVID or a missed playoff for any reason. Now, granted, this was never intended to be an actual proposal, and they knew full well that the MLB was never going to say yes to this. It was really just meant as an idea of where the Players Association was coming from. What they certainly didn't expect was the response that they got just a day later, when rumors started to spread that the MLB was working on a plan for a last-ditch resort 48 to 50 game season. Now again, as none of this was done under the guise of it being an actual negotiation, it could very well just be a coincidence that the MLB let slip their last resort plan just a day after the 114 game proposal. But it seems much more likely that it was them sending a clear message that the Players Association was just as far off with this proposal as they had been with their first proposal. That all brings us to Monday. Just a week removed from their latest back and forth, the MLB announced a new proposal for a payout of 75% of their prorated pay over a 76-game season. Now, a lot of takes that I've heard from this early on make it sound like this is the MLB saying that they're going to pay the players 75% of their original contracts, but it's far from that. What this is actually saying is that they're ready to pay the players 75% of what their contracts would have been for a 76-game season. So even at 100% prorated pay over 76 games, this is just 47% of what they would have gotten from a full season. Then reducing it down to 75% of that prorated pay, they would be looking at a roughly 35% of what they would have made from a full season. And obviously at this point, we're far from anybody expecting 100% of a full season's contract. And with the alternatives being a potential 50-game season, even with 100% proration, meaning that the players would only get 30% of their original contracts, and the other alternative being no season at all, a 35% seems like a decent deal. But even if it wasn't for the seemingly hard line drawn in the sand by the players at 100% proration, this plan does have one more addendum, and that is if the playoffs were to be missed by a second COVID outbreak or really for any other reason, the MLB could take another $443 million of the $1.4 billion that the players stand to gain from the playoffs, which would leave them with just 25% of their original contracts. But with all this quickly spinning downward and seemingly more and more out of control, I want to take a quick step back to where this all began and that first proposal from the MLB, especially that 50-50 revenue split that was such a non-starter for the players. Because at first glance, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. After all, if you're familiar with any of the other leagues, this is pretty much how they run. In the NFL, the players get 47% of the revenue and just signed a new CBA for 48% and eventually 48.5%. Meanwhile, in both the NBA and the NHL, the players split 50-50 with the owners, just like what was proposed here. The reason a split works in those leagues, though, is because those are salary-capped leagues. The money from that split goes into a pool that then becomes the salary cap. Now, that's a little oversimplified, but basically, as the revenue goes up, so does the salary cap, and so does the potential earnings for the players. But the MLB is not a salary-capped league. So once again, to oversimplify a bit, that means that there is no direct tie, or at least not as much of a direct tie, between the revenue that the league sees and the contracts that the players end up getting. In the end, the players get what they get, and the league ends up getting the rest. So why the split now? Well, with it almost guaranteed that any return will be a fanless return, at least as far as stadiums are concerned anyway, and the loss of any TV revenue for missed games during the regular season, a lot of owners are looking at the potential of being in the red for the season. The biggest of these issues, and the reason for a revenue split proposal, is the former, because even with an 82-game season, with their prorated salaries, the players would end up losing half of what they would have made, and the same goes for the owners as far as TV deals are concerned. But without a revenue split, the burden of losing all of the income that would come from fans coming into stadiums falls solely on the owners. So with that in mind, it's pretty easy to understand why the players might not be that receptive to the idea of a revenue split, especially in a year like this. Plus, it's not like the owners would be that receptive to accepting this style of plan if, in an alternate universe, the 2020 season saw a massive boom in attendance where every stadium was filled to the brim for every game. So why should the players be expected to share in the struggles of a down year if they aren't going to get any more from an especially good year? But even with that said, based on some rough estimations that Jeff Passan makes in an article that I will link down below, which I highly recommend reading, he suggests that it is entirely possible that even with a 50-50 revenue split in a season like this with no fans, the players could still end up making as much to not slightly more what they would make with a prorated salary for that half season. So if that's the case, then why wouldn't they have accepted this deal? Well, ultimately it boils down to the fact that the MLBPA doesn't want anything to do with anything resembling a salary cap, even if it is just for one season. They have spent years and years doing everything they can to avoid a salary cap like the plague that we are all trying to avoid right now. The reasons for that are beyond the scope of this video, but one potential such reason would be the fact that a salary cap can only really be as strong as its weakest link. So the idea is that by not having a salary cap, some of the bigger market teams like the Yankees and Red Sox can spend a lot more money than they otherwise would be able to on players, and so in the end the players do end up making more than they would in a salary cap. But regardless of their reasons, their feelings towards anything close to a salary cap were made very clear by this quote from their executive director, Tony Clark. So where does all this leave us? Well, the first reaction that most people have, and that I've seen a number of times, is that this is a really bad look for the MLB. And it absolutely is. It's hard not to look at this and just see it as an argument between millionaires and billionaires over who gets the extra dollar, all while preventing us from a return to the sports world, which a lot of us could sorely use. And when we see a financial dispute between a league and its players, whether it's this one or any number of lockouts or holdouts from the past, we see the players often as just a group of multimillionaires, the people that we see and cheer for on TV every day and know by name. But what we don't usually think of is the much higher percentage of players who are living on league minimum. So yes, for all the big names that are on long-term multi-million-dollar contracts, this might not matter quite as much as far as their long-term lives are concerned. But for all the guys who are on league minimums, again, many of whom, especially in a league like baseball, where there's no salary cap and the bottom line isn't quite as well controlled as it is in the NFL, some of these guys are living paycheck to paycheck. And sure, the amount on those paychecks, even at the league minimums, is likely to be well more than most people in the workforce will ever see on one of their own paychecks. You have to also consider that most of these guys left college or gave up a chance to go to college at all in order to follow their dream to play in the league, especially in baseball where a number of these guys come straight from high school. But even outside of their salaries or the sacrifices that they made in order to get to the point that they're at, a lot of these guys at the lower end of the league, unlike the faces of the league who might end up spending 10 plus years in it, will probably just spend 2 or maybe even 1 year in the league, and this is their one chance to make the money that they might need in order to get them through a good portion of the rest of their life. So yes, it's hard for most of us to feel too sorry for guys missing out on a few $1,000,000 of $100 million contracts. But there are even more players that are missing out not only on the chance to make money that could change their lives and that of their families, but also on the chance to ever make that money in the future. And if I'm going to talk about and defend the guys that are on the low end of the major leagues and their fight to make the money that they need, I would be remiss to point out that if these two sides can't come to some kind of deal and we end up missing out on a season, it's also threatening the jobs and livelihoods of a number of people that these teams employ. I could sit here and talk for a while about how the MLB, especially now, cannot afford to lose a season, especially with questions about fan attendance, and it seeming like they may have plateaued a little bit after falling in the ratings for decades. But a missing season now could have a much bigger impact than just taking a step backwards in the effort to revive ratings. There are a number of teams that missing an entire season could mean that they end up going bankrupt and even in some cases having to sell the team entirely. And in the case of smaller markets, especially like Oakland or Tampa Bay, where they have questions about their stadiums as it is, that could even end up leading to potential movements of teams. And again, for the players, regardless of where they are in the league, a missing season means missing out on one of the few years of their lives that they'll be able to make the kind of money that professional sports provides. And beyond that, if the Players Association and the league can't get a deal done now, with another bargaining agreement due in just over a year, it's hard not to imagine that the same issues couldn't crop up and cause maybe even a lockout and a hindrance to a whole nother season. Regardless of what the future holds, we are now in do or die time for the MLB. With it seeming like half of a season is already out the window, a third of a season could be what the MLB needs to shave years off of what is already going to be a lengthy recovery period for them and the other leagues coming out of this. And for the MLB, especially with potential playoffs coming for the NHL and NBA before the NFL season starts, even without a second outbreak of COVID, they're going to be up against it as far as competition goes. So they do need to take advantage of any time where they might be able to come back first and get that head start that they would need. At this point, it seems like it's anybody's guess what will happen and how much of the season the MLB will end up being able to rescue, if they can rescue any of it. There are those who have been a part of these situations firsthand before and insist that this is just business as usual and we will end up seeing some baseball once a deal gets done. But there is also plenty of reason for concern. So for now, we will just have to hope and pray that we do eventually get to see some baseball. And if somehow somebody from the league is watching this, it should tell you something that even me as a Mariners fan desperately wants to see something happen and desperately wants to see baseball come back this season. But that's all I've got for now, and I'm sure we will see more from this in the days to come, and if there is a decision finally made, I will keep you up to date on that. But other than that, if you have made it to this point, as always, thank you for watching. If you did like this video, please do hit that like button. If you really liked it and want to see more of my thoughts on the sports world, even in the state it's in now, do hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything going on in the sports world down in the comments section below. Other than that, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!